my daughter said with a smug tone. "We're done taking care of you," my son just smirked. Minutes later my phone buzzed. A text from my lawyer. Should I release their $14,000 monthly support? I typed one word back. Denied. Before we continue, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to hear my story. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. Now let me tell you my story. The Dubois family trust was not a product of my husband's legacy, but of my own foresight. When my beloved Samuel passed away, he left me with a beautiful home, a wealth of memories and a modest portfolio. The true fortune, the one that would later become the source of so much contention, I built myself quietly and methodically, in the years that followed. My name is Dr. Lena Dubois. For 40 years my world was the hushed climate-controlled halls of museums and the dusty archives of university libraries. As an art historian and curator, my eye was trained to see the hidden value in things others overlooked. A forgotten painting in a cluttered estate sale, a piece of pottery misattributed and undervalued. I turned my passion into a lucrative consulting practice. My eye for beauty and my shrewd investments, creating a fortune that far surpassed what Samuel and I had ever dreamed of. My children, Celine and Adrian, were the center of my universe. I wanted to give them something I never had, the freedom from financial worry. I didn't want them to chase salaries. I wanted them to chase their passions. So I established the trust. Managed by my calm and discreet lawyer, Mr. Henderson, it was designed to be a foundation, not a crutch. Upon their 25th birthdays, each of my children would begin to receive a generous monthly stipend. The amount was substantial, $7,000 each for a total of $14,000 a month. Enough to allow them to build their careers, to travel, to create without the soul-crushing burden of debt. It was, I believed, the greatest gift a mother could give. The gift of a life without fear. I had visions of my daughter, Celine, using this freedom to start a real impactful business, and of my son Adrian finally producing the documentaries he had always spoken of so passionately. The money was not meant to be a permanent subsidy for their lives. It was meant to be the launch pad. I was giving them wings, and I waited with a mother's hopeful heart to watch them fly. For a time it seemed my investment was paying off. They were by all outward appearances soaring. In the modern world, my children were not just successful, they were a brand. Their lives as presented to the world were a masterclass in curated, aspirational living. Celine, at 36, was a lifestyle brand consultant. Her Instagram feed was a flawless sun-drenched tapestry of a life lived beautifully. One week she was posting from a sun-drenched infinity pool in Bali, a sponsored kaftan billowing around her, the caption full of inspirational quotes about manifesting your best life. The next, she was in a minimalist, all-white kitchen, artfully arranging organic produce for a post about clean living. Her followers saw a successful self-made woman, a boss babe who had built an empire on her own impeccable taste. They didn't see the truth. They didn't see that the ticket to Bali, the lease on the all-white apartment, the very organic produce on her marble countertop, were all funded by the quiet monthly deposits from a trust set up by a mother she rarely mentioned. Adrian, at 34, was the artistic counterpoint to his sister's commercial success. He was an independent documentary filmmaker. He lived in a trendy industrial loft in the city's arts district, a space with exposed brick walls, a gleaming espresso machine, and a collection of vintage film cameras that were more decorative than functional. He was, as he always told me, perpetually in pre-production. He spent his days in coffee shops, his laptop open, his expression one of deep creative torment. He spoke passionately about the projects he was developing, a gritty exposé on urban decay, a lyrical portrait of a forgotten jazz musician. He attended film festivals, he networked, he talked a brilliant game, but in 10 years he had yet to produce a single finished film. The trust fund allowed him to live the life of an artist without the inconvenient, and often unpleasant, necessity of actually creating any art. They had taken the freedom I had given them and used it not to build lives of substance, but to construct elaborate, beautiful facades. They were living inside their own marketing campaigns, and they had become so skilled at selling the image of success that they seemed to have convinced even themselves. I watched from the quiet of my own life, a silent and increasingly concerned investor. The first time I heard the lie, it was a shock, a sudden, discordant note in the carefully composed symphony of our family's relationship. I was in the kitchen preparing a small lunch for Celine, who had deigned to check in on Mom on her way to a yoga class. She was on her phone in the living room, her voice a low, confidential murmur. "I know, it's exhausting," She was saying to a friend. I have to go see my mother. It's like a whole day. Every time, the emotional labor is just draining. But what can you do? She's all alone. She needs me. I stood frozen, a knife hovering over the tomato I was slicing. Emotional labor. She needs me. The words were so utterly completely divorced from our reality that for a moment, I thought I had misheard. I was a perfectly healthy, independent, and busy 65-year-old woman. Her visits were not a duty. They were a gift, one that she bestowed with increasing rarity. Then I realized the terrible truth. The narrative had been rewritten, in her mind, and in the story she told her friends. She was not the recipient of my lifelong generosity. She was the caregiver. She was the dutiful daughter burdened with the heavy, time-consuming task of taking care of her aging, needy mother. The monthly stipend, the $7,000 that landed in her account like clockwork on the first of every month, was no longer a gift. It had been reframed, in the twisted logic of her own entitlement, as a payment. It was a salary for the job of being my daughter. Once I saw it, I started to see it everywhere. Adrian would call, his voice full of a weary, artistic sigh. Just wanted to see how you were, Mom. It's been a crazy week trying to get this new project funded. But I always make time for you. The implication was clear. His call was a sacrifice, a precious moment carved out of his busy life. For me, they had together constructed a false narrative, a story that allowed them to live off my money without the uncomfortable acknowledgement of their own dependence. They had cast me in the role of the frail, lonely, and slightly burdensome matriarch, and themselves as the selfless, devoted children who were nobly bearing the weight of my care. It was a fiction, a poorly constructed forgery of a life, but it was a fiction they had come to believe with all their hearts, and it was a fiction that was about to be put to the ultimate test. The knee replacement was a choice, not a crisis. My doctor had been advising it for years. The arthritis in my left knee, a souvenir from a long-ago skiing accident, had finally become a constant grinding pain, a limitation on the active life I loved. I was tired of saying no to long walks, to gardening, to travel. I wanted my freedom back. I scheduled the surgery for the fall, a quiet time of year. The procedure itself was routine, a marvel of modern medicine, but the recovery, my doctor explained, would be a challenge. For the first 2 to 3 weeks I would be largely immobile, dependent on crutches and a great deal of rest. I would need help. This, I thought, would be a chance for my children. A real, tangible way for them to show the love and support they so often spoke of in the abstract. This was not a vague checking in. This was a genuine need. I called them together, a conference call that had to be scheduled a week in advance to accommodate their busy lives. I explained the situation simply and directly. The surgery is on the 15th, I said. I'll be in the hospital for 2 nights, and then I'll be home. The doctor says I will need round-the-clock assistance for at least the first 2 weeks. I won't be able to cook, to drive, to do much of anything for myself. I paused, then made my request. I was hoping, I said, my voice full of a hope I didn't realize was so fragile, that the 2 of you could take turns. Maybe you could stay with me, 1 week each, just to help me get through the worst of it. The silence on the other end of the line was long and heavy. I could almost hear the frantic, resentful calculations happening in their heads. Colleen spoke first, her voice a long theatrical sigh. Oh, Mom, of course we will. It's just the timing is terrible. I have the launch of the new fall campaign. It's my busiest season, but, for you, we'll make it work. Her reluctance was a palpable thing, a bitter pill she was being forced to swallow.
Adrian was no better.
Yeah, Mom, of course, he said, his voice full of a weary, artistic resignation. I'm right in the middle of a major grant application. The deadline is a nightmare, but family comes first. I guess the film will just have to wait. They had agreed, but their agreement was not a gift. It was a sacrifice, a burden, a monumental disruption to their important lives which I, their mother, was so thoughtlessly imposing upon them. They were not children agreeing to care for their mother in a time of need. They were employees, being assigned an unpleasant and deeply inconvenient new project. The performance of their caregiving was about to begin. The 2 weeks following my surgery were among the longest and most demoralizing of my life. My children's help was not an act of love. It was a masterclass in passive aggression, a performance of caregiving so hollow and resentful it was almost worse than no help at all. Celine took the first week. She arrived at my house not with a pot of homemade soup, but with 3 suitcases, her laptop, and a palpable air of martyrdom. My comfortable guest room was immediately transformed into her satellite office and personal spa. The house, which should have been a quiet sanctuary for my recovery, was filled with the sounds of her loud, important-sounding conference calls. Her idea of caring for me was to order expensive exotic meals from food delivery apps, which she would then charge to the credit card I had given her for household emergencies. When I would ask for a simple cup of tea, she would let out a long put-upon sigh and say, "In a minute, Mom, I'm just in the middle of a synergy meeting." The tea, when it finally arrived, would be lukewarm. She complained constantly. The Wi-Fi was too slow. My television didn't have the right streaming services. The silence of the suburbs was unsettling. She spent most of her time shut in the guest room, emerging only to take glamorous selfies in my garden, her captions a testament to her self-sacrifice. Taking a moment for self-care during a difficult family week. So important to find the light. And family first, caregiver life. Adrian's week was no better. He was not as overtly resentful as Celine, but his neglect was just as profound. He saw his time at my house as an artist's retreat. He would sleep until noon, then spend the rest of the day in my library, his headphones on, supposedly writing his grant proposal, but more often, I suspected, just watching obscure foreign films. My requests for help were met with a vague, artistic detachment. "Hey Mom, I'm right in the middle of a creative breakthrough," he would say, not looking up from his laptop. "Can it wait?" My pain, my needs, my slow, difficult recovery were an inconvenient interruption to his creative process. He did not cook. He lived on toast and the leftover, expensive meals Celine had ordered. I, a woman who had just undergone major surgery, found myself hobbling to the refrigerator on my crutches to find myself something to eat. While my son, my healthy, 34-year-old son, was in the next room breaking through. Through it all, I said nothing. I was in pain. I was vulnerable, and I had to admit, dependent on them for the most basic things. I endured their sighs, their eye rolls, their barely concealed impatience. I listened to them on the phone with their friends, complaining about the nightmare of being stuck in the suburbs taking care of Mom. I was a prisoner in my own home, a patient in the care of the two most resentful, self-absorbed nurses in the world. And with every sigh, with every moment of neglect, the cold, hard knot of resentment in my own chest grew a little tighter. The price of their care was my dignity, and the bill was becoming impossibly high. After 2 excruciating weeks, I was finally blessedly beginning to heal. I could move around the house on my own with a cane, my knee a dull ache rather than a sharp, searing pain. I could make my own tea. The period of my forced dependence was coming to an end, and with it, I thought, my children's resentful occupation of my home. I was wrong. Celine, it turned out, had one final performance in mind. She announced it to me one afternoon, her voice full of a bright, false generosity that immediately set my teeth on edge. "Mom," she said, "now that you're feeling better, I think we should have a little celebration, a family appreciation dinner, this Saturday, just to, celebrate your recovery." It sounded lovely on the surface, but I knew my daughter. I knew this was not about me. "I'll invite Aunt Denise and a few of the cousins," she continued, her mind already racing with the logistics of the event. "And I thought it would be a nice chance to thank Adrian and me, in front of the family, for all our help over the past few weeks. It's been a lot, and I think it's important to acknowledge that." There it was, the true purpose of the event. It was not a celebration of my recovery. It was a public relations event. A self-congratulatory ceremony designed to showcase what wonderful, devoted, and self-sacrificing children they were. They were throwing themselves a party in my house, and I was expected to be the guest of honor at my own public thank you. "That's a lovely idea, dear," I said, my voice carefully neutral. The path of least resistance was still, I told myself, the path to peace. The days leading up to the dinner were a repeat of the pre-wedding frenzy, a smaller but no less intense performance of Chloe's directorial ambitions. "We can't just have one of your casseroles, Mom," she said, wrinkling her nose. "This is a special occasion. I'll have that lovely little Italian place downtown Catter. It's expensive, but it's worth it for a celebration." I knew without asking that the we who would be paying for this expensive catering was in fact me. I simply nodded. She rearranged the living room again, critiqued my choice of tablecloth, and spent an hour on the phone with the caterer, discussing the wine pairings. She was not a daughter planning a dinner for her mother. She was an event planner, executing a brand-building opportunity. The stage was being set for her final grand performance. A performance in which she and her brother were the heroes, the selfless caregivers, and I was the grateful, tearful recipient of their noble sacrifice. She had written the script, she had designed the set, and she had cast all the parts, and I, in my weary, pained silence, had agreed to play mine. The night of the family appreciation dinner arrived, and my house was once again transformed into a stage. The dining room table, my solid, dependable oak table, was covered in a crisp white linen cloth, and set with gleaming rented silverware. The scent of an expensive catered osso buco wafted from the kitchen, a foreign perfume in a space that usually smelled of my own, simpler cooking. My sister Denise, and a handful of my cousins arrived, their arms full of flowers and bottles of wine. They came to me first, their faces full of genuine love and concern. "Marty, you look wonderful. How's the knee feeling? We were so worried about you." Then, Chloe and Derek, and Adrian, made their entrance. They were not children coming to a family dinner, they were the hosts, the stars of the evening. Celine was in a chic black dress, her smile bright and performative. Adrian was in his uniform of artistic seriousness, a black turtleneck and a look of thoughtful detachment. They immediately took control of the narrative. "Thank you all for coming," Chloe said, her voice ringing with a gracious, welcoming warmth that was entirely false. "It's so wonderful to finally celebrate Mom's recovery. It's been a difficult few weeks for all of us, but we're just so happy to see her back on her feet." She and Adrian then proceeded to work the room, accepting the praise and admiration of the relatives with a practiced, humble grace. "You two have just been saints," one of my cousins said to Celine, her eyes shining with misguided admiration. "Your mother is so lucky to have such wonderful, devoted children." "Oh, it was nothing," Celine replied with a self-deprecating wave of her hand. "Family does what you have to do. We were just happy we could be there for her." Adrian, cornered by another cousin, adopted a look of noble artistic sacrifice. "The film had to wait, of course," he said with a weary sigh. "But my mother's health, that's the real masterpiece. You know, I sat in my armchair in the corner of the living room, a quiet, smiling observer at my own party, and I listened to them. I listened to them spin their beautiful, intricate web of lies. They were so good at it. They were so convincing. They were not just lying to our family, they were lying to themselves. They had so completely and thoroughly rewritten the story of the past 2 weeks that they had actually come to believe it. They were not the resentful, neglectful children who had treated their recovering mother as an inconvenience. They were the heroes of the story, the selfless caregivers who had put their own brilliant lives on hold to rush to their mother's side. The performance was breathtaking in its audacity, and as I sat there watching them soak in the undeserved praise, the cold, hard knot of resentment in my chest, the one that had been forming for years, finally solidified into something new. Something cold, hard, and as sharp as a diamond. It was no longer resentment. It was resolve. We moved to the dining room. The catered osso buco was served, the expensive wine was poured, the conversation was light, cheerful, and full of the easy, familiar rhythms of a family gathering. But beneath the surface, for me, the tension was a high, keening note that only I could hear. Celine sat at the head of the table, in the chair that had always been my husband's. She was the mistress of ceremonies, the director of this final, triumphant scene. She guided the conversation, she laughed at the right moments. She was the very picture of a successful, happy woman in her prime. After the main course was finished, during a lull in the conversation, she stood up, her wine glass in her hand, her face was flushed with wine and success. This was her moment, the moment the entire evening had been building towards. "I just want to say a few words," she began, her voice full of a warm, practiced sincerity. She spoke beautifully about family, about the importance of being there for each other in times of need. She spoke of the scare we had all had with my surgery. "It really puts things in perspective," she said, her eyes shining with a false sentimental light. "It reminds you of what's truly important." Then she turned her attention to the true purpose of her speech. "And I just want to say on behalf of myself and Adrian, how proud I am of us for stepping up these past few weeks. It wasn't easy. Our lives, our careers had to be put on hold. But we did it. We were there for our mother when she needed us." She raised her glass, a broad, self-satisfied smile on her face. She looked down the table, directly at me. This final line was not for the guests. It was for me. It was a declaration, a final public statement of her role, and of mine. "And now that Mom is better," she announced, her voice a bright, triumphant pronouncement, "we're done taking care of you." She said it with a laugh. A light, witty, dismissive sound, as if she were a long-suffering employee, finally declaring her freedom from a difficult, demanding boss. It was a joke, a punchline. The punchline was me. My son Adrian, sitting across the table, did not laugh. He just smirked. A small, cool, arrogant curve of his lips. It was a silent and utterly damning endorsement of his sister's cruelty. The insult was not in the words themselves. It was in the smug, self-congratulatory tone. It was in the public declaration of their burden. It was in the complete and utter erasure of my own role in their lives, the lifetime of care I had given them, the very financial foundation upon which their important lives were built. I was not a mother to be loved and respected. I was a job to be finished, a task to be completed, and they were, with great relief, finally clocking out. The insult, delivered with the bright, confident flourish of a punchline, hung in the air for a moment. It was followed by a sound I will never forget, the sound of polite, complicit laughter. A few of my cousins, caught up in the triumphant, self-congratulatory narrative Celine had been spinning all night, chuckled. They saw it as she intended it, a witty, slightly edgy but ultimately harmless joke. A modern daughter teasing her mother. They did not see the deep, profound and breathtaking cruelty that lay beneath it. My sister Denise did. Her face, which had been a mask of simmering fury all evening, went completely terrifyingly still. She stared at her niece with a look of such pure, unadulterated contempt that for a moment I thought she might actually stand up and strike her. But the loudest sound in the room, for me, was the silence. The silence from the people who knew the truth. My silence. I stared at my daughter, the beautiful, successful and utterly monstrous stranger at the head of my table. I stared at my son, his arrogant, self-satisfied smirk, a mirror of his sister's smugness. In that single, terrible and profoundly clarifying moment, something inside me finally and irrevocably broke. It was not a loud, shattering break. It was a quiet, clean and final snap. It was the sound of a cord, stretched to its absolute limit for years, finally giving way. The cord of a mother's unconditional love. The cord of a lifetime of patience, of accommodation, of quiet, uncomplaining sacrifice. The hurt, the anger, the resentment, it all vanished, replaced by a feeling I had not felt in a very long time. A feeling of pure, cold and absolute power. The power of a woman who has finally and completely run out of dams to give. And in that profound, terrible and utterly silent moment, as the polite, complicit laughter died down, a new sound emerged, a soft, electronic buzz. It was my phone sitting on the table beside my plate. I had forgotten it was even there. The screen lit up, a small bright beacon in the suddenly tense atmosphere of the room. I looked down. It was a text message. A message that was, in its own way, a response from the universe itself, a piece of perfect cosmic timing that was so exquisite it was almost terrifying. The text was not from a friend. It was not from a family member. It was from Mr. Henderson, my lawyer, the discreet and efficient manager of the Dubois Family Trust. I picked up my phone, my movements slow and deliberate. The room was watching me now, the mood having shifted from awkward humor to a tense, uncertain curiosity. My lack of reaction to Chloe's joke was more unsettling than any outburst would have been. I looked at the glowing screen. The text message was simple, professional, and utterly devastatingly opportune. It was a message Mr. Henderson sent me on the first of every month, a simple procedural check-in before he executed the transaction that had been the invisible foundation of my children's lives for a decade. The text read, "Good morning, Dr. Dubois. It is the first of the month. Should I release their $14,000 monthly support?" The words on the screen seemed to hum with a strange, powerful energy. $14,000 monthly support. The number, the reality of it stood in such stark, brutal contrast to the fiction that had just been so publicly, so smugly declared at my dinner table. "We're done taking care of you." The irony was so profound, so absolute, it was almost beautiful. They thought they were the caregivers, the ones who were burdened. They had no idea that they were the dependents, the ones who were, and had always been, taken care of. I looked up from the glowing screen of my phone. I looked at my daughter's face, flushed with wine and self-satisfaction, her expression one of impatient, condescending curiosity. "What's wrong with Mom now?" her eyes seemed to say. I looked at my son, his smirk still playing on his lips, his entire being a study in arrogant artistic detachment from the messy emotional world of his mother. And in that moment, the decision was not a decision at all. It was a conclusion. A logical, inevitable, and deeply, deeply satisfying conclusion. It was the final balancing entry in a ledger that had been catastrophically out of balance for far too long. The power to restore that balance was now quite literally in the palm of my hand. The question had been asked, the choice was mine, and for the first time in a very long time I was going to choose myself. I took a quiet, steadying breath. My expression, I am sure, did not change. The hurt, the shock, the years of quiet, simmering resentment, it all coalesced into a single sharp point of cold diamond-hard resolve. My thumb, which had been hovering over the screen, moved with a calm, deliberate purpose. I typed a single powerful and utterly unambiguous word in response to Mr. Henderson's question. Denied. The word on the screen was a beautiful, perfect and final thing. It was a closed door. It was a turned key. It was a final, emphatic and long overdue no. I pressed send. The small swoosh sound of the message leaving my phone was almost inaudible, but to me it was the sound of a guillotine blade falling, the sound of a final, irrevocable severance. The financial umbilical cord, which had been nourishing my two ungrateful adult children for a decade, had just been cut, and they had no idea. I placed my phone face down on the table, the small, quiet click of the glass on the linen a sound of finality. The transaction was complete. The rest was just paperwork. I looked up, my gaze sweeping over the faces at the table, my cousins, who were watching me with a confused concern, my sister, who was watching me with a dawning fierce and deeply appreciative understanding, and my children, who were watching me with a mixture of annoyance and impatience, completely oblivious to the financial cataclysm that had just been unleashed upon their lives. In that moment I felt a strange and wonderful lightness, a sense of freedom so profound it was almost dizzying. The burden I had been carrying for years, the burden of their entitlement, the burden of my own silent complicity was gone. I had been the secret silent engine of their lives for so long, and I had just with a single word turned the engine off. The rest of the evening, the rest of my life was now mine, and I was going to start living it right now. With the single word denied sent out into the digital ether, a profound sense of peace settled over me. The battle was already over, the final decisive shot had been fired, and my opponents didn't even know the war had begun. All that was left was to exit the field with my dignity intact. I slowly, and with a grace I did not feel but was determined to project, folded my linen napkin and placed it on the table beside my plate. I then stood up. My movement, so quiet and deliberate, immediately silenced the low, awkward chatter that had resumed at the table. All eyes were on me. "Mom, what are you doing?" Chloe asked, her voice sharp with irritation. "Sit down, you're making a scene." "No, dear," I said, my voice calm, and for the first time that night, completely free of any tension. "You are quite right. This dinner is about you, and I would not want to spoil your moment." I looked down the table, my gaze sweeping over the confused faces of my relatives, and then finally settling on my children. "You are absolutely right, Celine," I said, my voice as cool and clear as a winter morning. "You have been so burdened for so long, and you are right to be done. You are done, in every sense of the word." The double meaning, the quiet, devastating finality of my words, was completely lost on them. They just heard a strange, cryptic statement from their dramatic mother. Without another word, I turned and walked out of my own dining room. I did not storm out. I did not slam the door. My steps were unhurried, my posture erect. It was a quiet and utterly final departure. I was not just leaving a dinner party. I was leaving a role I had played for far too long, the role of the quiet, accommodating and endlessly forgiving mother. I retreated to the quiet sanctuary of my study, the one room in the house they rarely entered. I closed the door, the soft click of the latch, a sound of profound relief. I walked over to the large window that overlooked the moonlit garden and I stood there, just breathing. I could hear the faint muffled sounds of the party continuing without me, the murmur of confused conversation, a forced, too loud laugh from Derek. They would be talking about me, of course, about my bizarre behavior, about how sensitive and difficult I was. They would be reinforcing their own narrative, the story of their own selfless sacrifice and my ungrateful emotional instability. Let them talk, I thought. Let them have their final self-congratulatory moments. Their reality, their entire carefully constructed world, was now operating on a 30-day timer, and they had no idea. I felt no guilt. I felt no remorse. I felt only a vast and deeply peaceful sense of release. I had been the silent, invisible foundation of their lives, and I had just with a single quiet act resigned. The house they had been living in, the house of my generosity, was about to be metaphorically, and very, very literally foreclosed upon, and I was finally free. The new reality began to dawn not with a bang, but with the quiet, humiliating beep of a declined credit card. The day after the disastrous dinner party, Celine, in a characteristic act of self-care and retail therapy, went to her favorite designer boutique. The dinner had been a success in her mind. She had been the star. Her mother's bizarre exit just a minor, eccentric footnote. She had earned a reward for her weeks of hardship. She swept through the store, a vision of confident, casual chic, gathering an armful of expensive silks and cashmeres. At the checkout counter, she presented her credit card, a high-limit piece of platinum, with a casual, practiced flourish. The young, impeccably dressed sales clerk swiped it. A small, discreet, but unmistakable beep of denial came from the machine. The clerk, her face a mask of professional politeness, swiped it again. The same quiet, ugly sound. "I'm so sorry, Miss Dubois," the clerk murmured, her eyes not quite meeting Celine's. "There seems to be a problem with the card." "That's impossible," Celine snapped, her voice sharp with annoyance. "Try it again. It's a corporate card." A lie, of course. It was a card linked to the Dubois family trust, a fact she rarely if ever acknowledged. The clerk tried a third time. "I'm afraid it's been declined, ma'am," she said, her voice a low, embarrassed whisper. A hot, ugly flush of red crept up Celine's neck. A small line had begun to form behind her. She fumbled in her wallet for her debit card, her movements suddenly clumsy and flustered. "Fine," she said, her voice a low, furious hiss. "I'll use my debit card." She inserted the card, punched in her PIN and waited. The machine whirred for a moment, and then a new message appeared on the small screen: insufficient funds. The first real crack in her perfect, curated world had appeared. It was a small crack, but it was a public one. Humiliated, her face burning, she had to abandon her pile of expensive clothes on the counter and flee the store, her mind a chaotic swirl of confusion and rage. The expected $7,000 deposit, the deposit that was the very foundation of her lifestyle brand, had not arrived, and her carefully balanced financial ecosystem was already beginning to collapse. At the same time that Celine was experiencing her public humiliation in the boutique, her brother Adrien was facing his own private financial reckoning. He was in his trendy industrial loft, the one with the exposed brick and the view of the city skyline, a space that was the perfect backdrop for his performance as a serious, successful artist. His landlord, a large, impatient man with a handlebar mustache, was standing in his doorway, holding a piece of paper. "Mr. Dubois," the landlord said, his voice a low, rumbling growl, "we have a problem. Your rent check bounced." Adrien stared at him, a look of pure, arrogant disbelief on his face. "Bounced? That's not possible. There must be a mistake with your bank." "There's no mistake with my bank, son," the landlord said, waving the check which had a large, angry red stamp on it. "The mistake is with yours. It says here account closed." "Account closed?" Adrien repeated, the words nonsensical, like a language he didn't speak. He pulled out his phone, his hands suddenly trembling, and logged into his banking app. He stared at the screen, his blood turning to ice water in his veins. His checking account, which yesterday had held a comfortable four-figure balance, now showed a single, stark and terrifying number: $47.332. The panic, a cold, sickening wave washed over him. The automatic first-of-the-month deposit from the trust, the $7,000 that paid for this loft, for his expensive coffee, for his entire work-free artistic lifestyle, was not there. He flew into a full-blown panic. He called Celine, his voice a high, frantic squeal that was utterly at odds with his cool, detached persona. "Celine, the money's not there. Did you get the money?" "No," she shrieked back, her own voice a mirror of his hysteria. "My cards were just declined. The account is empty. What the hell is going on?" They were two trapeze artists, who had spent a decade soaring with a confident, careless grace, and had just looked down to discover that their safety net had been completely and silently removed. Together on the phone, they pieced together the terrible dawning truth. The joke at the dinner party, their mother's strange, cold silence, her quiet, cryptic departure, and the timing. The first of the month. It was not a coincidence. It was not a bank error. It was a consequence, a direct and devastating retaliation. "She did this," Celine whispered, her voice a mixture of awe and pure, undiluted terror. "The old woman actually did this." The panic was no longer just a feeling. It was a reality. They were not the caregivers, they were the dependents, and their sole source of funding, the quiet, resentful woman they had so casually and publicly dismissed, had just with a single silent and utterly devastating act cut them off. The call came in the early afternoon. I was in my garden, my sanctuary, enjoying a cup of tea in the crisp autumn sun. It was the first truly peaceful moment I had felt in years. My phone, which I had placed on the small table beside me, began to ring. It was Celine. I let it ring 3 times, a small quiet assertion of my newfound power. Then I answered. "Hello, Celine," I said, my voice as calm and serene as the garden around me. "Mom, what did you do?" Her voice was not the smooth, controlled purr of the lifestyle consultant. It was a high, panicked screech, the sound of pure, undiluted and deeply entitled terror. "The money isn't there. The trust deposit didn't come. I called Mr. Henderson and he said you canceled it. He said you closed the account. You can't do that." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my tea before I answered. "Yes, I can, dear," I said, my voice still perfectly calm. "I am the sole trustee, it's my money. I can do whatever I like with it." But our lives depend on that money," she shrieked, and in that single desperate and beautifully honest sentence, she had finally, for the first time in a decade, admitted the truth. Her entire beautiful curated life was a lie, a performance funded by me. "I have bills to pay. Adrian's rent check bounced. My cards are declined. How are we supposed to live?" Her panic was a symphony to my ears. Not because I was a cruel woman, but because it was the sound of a long overdue reality finally, and violently, crashing down upon her. "I'm not sure, Celine," I said, my voice full of a cool, clinical detachment. "But I am sure it is no longer my problem to solve." But you can't just cut us off," she sobbed, her fury now dissolving into a desperate, pleading whimper. "We're your children." "Yes, you are," I said, and for the first time a note of the deep, profound hurt I had been suppressing crept into my voice. "And I am your mother, a mother who, if I recall correctly from last night's dinner, you are now done taking care of." The silence on the other end of the line was profound. She had no answer to that. I had taken her own smug, cruel words and turned them into the very bars of her new financial prison. The frantic, desperate call was not a negotiation. It was the final, dying gasp of a life of unearned privilege. The reckoning was here, and it was a conversation she was utterly unprepared to have. "Celine," I said, my voice now softening, not with pity but with a final, maternal clarity. "You were very clear last night. You and Adrian are done with the burden of taking care of me. And so I am done with the burden of taking care of you. Our financial arrangement, the one you had come to see as a job, is concluded. You are in effect fired." "Fired?" she whispered, the word a small, choked sound of disbelief. "Yes," I said. "And as with any termination, there is a severance. Mr. Henderson has been instructed to make one final, smaller deposit into your new separate accounts, which I'm sure you will be opening shortly. It is enough to cover your expenses for 1 month. After that you are on your own." I was not cutting them off to destroy them. I was cutting them off to perhaps save them. I was giving them one last final gift. The gift of reality. "You are both healthy, educated, and talented adults," I continued, my voice now full of a final liberating peace. "You have been living a wonderful life, a life you have so successfully promoted to the world. I have every confidence that you will figure out how to fund it on your own." Before she could protest further, before she could unleash another torrent of tears or threats, I said the final words. "I love you, my daughter, and I truly, truly wish you the best of luck." And then I hung up. I immediately silenced my phone, the angry buzzing of her repeated calls and texts a distant, meaningless annoyance. I placed it face down on the table. I took a sip of my tea. It was still warm. I looked out at my garden, at the beautiful, orderly world I had created with my own 2 hands. A world of quiet, of peace, of solvency. The price of their humiliation had been high. I may have lost my daughter, at least for a time. I had certainly lost the idealized image of the loving, grateful children I had always wanted. But in exchange I had regained something far more precious. I had regained myself. The new arrangement was simple. They were to be the architects of their own lives, and I was to be the quiet, and finally, peacefully, retired benefactor. The trust was closed, the account was settled, and I was, at long last, free.